On the morning of April 10th, 1912, the Titanic stood at the dock in Southampton like a floating city, proud and polished, her white hull gleaming beneath a pale spring sun. People gathered in crowds, some waving handkerchiefs, some clutching tickets, some staring in wonder at the ship that newspapers called unsinkable. To many, she was not just a vessel, but a promise of wealth, of freedom, of a new beginning. Among the passengers was 17-year-old Thomas Hale, traveling in third class with his mother, Margaret. They had sold nearly everything they owned in England to start over in America, where Thomas's uncle worked in a steel factory in Pittsburgh. Margaret held tightly to her son's arm as they boarded, her eyes filled with fear and hope in equal measure.
"This ship is enormous," Thomas whispered, craning his neck upward. Margaret smiled faintly. "If it can carry all this steel, it can carry our dreams too."
Elsewhere on the ship, Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the grand staircase, her gloved hand resting lightly on the polished railing. She was 18, traveling first class with her parents, surrounded by trunks of fine clothing and expectations just as heavy. Her life had been carefully planned: finishing school, a proper marriage, a comfortable future. But as she looked around the ship, she felt an unfamiliar excitement. The world suddenly seemed wider than the path laid out for her.
The Titanic departed to the sound of cheers and music. As the ship pulled away from the dock, passengers leaned over railings, waving to those left behind. Some cried, some laughed, and some stood silently, wondering when or if they would see home again.
Life aboard the Titanic. The first days at sea passed like a dream. In first class, elegant dinners were served beneath glittering chandeliers. Men in tailored suits discussed business and politics, while women in fine dresses laughed softly behind fans. Music drifted through the halls, and the ship felt less like transportation and more like a palace.
Eleanor attended dinners reluctantly at first, bored by conversations that felt rehearsed. One afternoon, seeking escape, she wandered onto the open deck. There, she noticed a young man leaning against the railing, gazing out at the endless blue.
Thomas had never seen an ocean before this journey. He could watch it for hours, the waves rising and falling like breathing. He was startled when Eleanor spoke.
"It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said. He turned, surprised by her refined accent and elegant coat. "Yes, miss. Yes, it feels like it goes on forever." They spoke only briefly, aware of the invisible boundaries between first and third class. Still, in that short exchange, both felt something unexpected, a moment of connection between two lives that would never normally meet. Below deck, third class was crowded but lively. Families shared stories in many languages. Children ran through corridors laughing, while musicians played fiddles late into the night. Though their cabins were small, spirits were high. Most passengers believed the Titanic was the safest ship ever built.
Margaret often reminded Thomas to be grateful. "We are lucky to be here," she said. "This ship is carrying us toward a better life." Warnings ignored. As the Titanic continued westward, wireless operators received messages from other ships, warning of ice ahead. The messages were noted, but did not cause alarm. The sea was calm, the night skies clear, and confidence in the ship ran deep.
On the evening of April 14, Eleanor stood on deck again, wrapped in a warm coat. The air was cold, sharper than before. She could see her breath as she exhaled. Far below, Thomas and his mother prepared for sleep. The engines hummed steadily, a sound that had become familiar and comforting.
Shortly before midnight, everything changed. The collision was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no violent shaking, just a strange shudder that ran through the ship, followed by silence. Thomas sat up in his bunk. "Did you feel that?" he asked.
Margaret nodded slowly. "Probably nothing," she said, though unease crept into her voice. Above,
Eleanor felt it too. Conversations paused. People looked at one another, puzzled but calm. Stewards reassured passengers that there was no danger. But deep within the ship, water was already rushing in. The truth emerges. As minutes passed, the mood shifted. Crew members moved more quickly now, their expressions tense. Orders were given in hushed voices. Life jackets were brought out, though many passengers laughed nervously, treating it as a precaution. Eleanor's mother insisted she put on her coat and life jacket, just in case, she said. Below deck, confusion spread faster. Third-class passengers struggled to understand what was happening. Corridors became crowded as people tried to reach the upper levels, only to find gates closed or directions unclear. Thomas took his mother's hand. "Stay with me," he said firmly. The ship began to tilt slightly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The lifeboats. On deck, lifeboats were uncovered. The order was given, women and children first. Some boats were lowered half full as passengers hesitated to leave the warmth and safety of the massive ship for the dark, icy sea. Eleanor stood beside her parents. Her father's face was pale but controlled. "You'll go with your mother," he said. "I'll follow on the next boat." She wanted to protest, but she knew better. As she stepped into the lifeboat, she looked back at the towering ship, unable to imagine it sinking. Across the ship, Thomas and Margaret finally reached the open deck. The cold air hit them like a wall. They saw the lifeboats, the panic, the realization spreading like wildfire. A crewman pointed to a nearby boat. "Women and children!" Margaret turned to Thomas, her eyes shining. "You must stay strong," she said. "I won't leave you," Thomas said, shaking his head. But the crewman insisted, pulling Margaret toward the boat. She clutched Thomas's hands tightly. "You must live," she whispered. "Promise me." Tears filled his eyes as the boat was lowered away, taking his mother with it. The final moments. As the Titanic's bow dipped lower, chaos erupted. The music continued to play. Soft, brave melodies carried into the freezing night. Some passengers prayed. Others stood frozen, unable to accept what was happening. Thomas remained on deck, helping where he could, guiding frightened children and steadying those who stumbled. The cold bit through his clothes, but adrenaline kept him moving. Eleanor's lifeboat drifted away, the sound of sobs echoing across the water. She watched the ship, lights still glowing, looking eerily peaceful despite its fate. Then, slowly, the Titanic broke apart. The sound was like thunder, a deep, terrible roar that seemed to tear the night itself. Eleanor covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Around her, people cried out in horror. The ship disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only darkness, debris, and the sound of voices calling for help. The aftermath. Hours later, as dawn approached, the lifeboats floated in a silent sea, scattered with ice. The cold was unbearable. Many had not survived the night. Thomas was pulled into a lifeboat just before the ship sank, his body numb and exhausted. He searched desperately for his mother among the boats, calling her name until his voice gave out. When rescue finally came in the form of the Carpathia, survivors were hauled aboard, wrapped in blankets, and given warm drinks. The reality of the disaster settled heavily over everyone. Eleanor found herself among strangers, her parents gone. She stared out at the sea, unable to comprehend the loss. Thomas, finally reunited with his mother, collapsed into her arms. They wept, not only for themselves, but for the thousands who had not survived. A changed world. In the days that followed, newspapers across the world reported the tragedy. The unsinkable ship had sunk on its maiden voyage. Questions were asked. Rules were changed. The world mourned. For Eleanor, life would never return to what it was. She used her family's remaining resources to help victims in their families, choosing a life of purpose rather than privilege. Thomas and Margaret reached America,
though their journey had been marked by loss. Thomas carried the memory of that night with him always, using it as fuel to work hard and build a future worthy of those who had perished. The ocean remembers. Years later, people would still speak of the Titanic, not just as a ship, but as a lesson. It reminded the world that progress without humility is dangerous, that nature cannot be conquered by confidence alone, and that in moments of crisis, humanity's true character is revealed. The ocean closed over the wreck, silent and vast, but it did not erase the stories. They lived on in memories, in families, and in the promise that such a tragedy would never be forgotten. And though the Titanic sank into darkness, the courage, love, and sacrifice shown that night continued to rise like a light against the cold, endless sea.